Hi, my name is Bruce Miller, and I'm with RimTech Consulting, and we're here today to talk about SharePoint for records and information management professionals. Just a note here that the materials in this session are not to be distributed by anyone outside your organization. We truly appreciate that. So the first thing we're going to cover is EDRMS fundamentals, electronic document and records management systems or solutions. We're going to cover the fundamentals before we get into the details of SharePoint. So right off the bat, these are the 7 SharePoint skills you'll need to do any form of EDRMS with SharePoint. You'll need to know libraries, content type, columns, document sets, which are really, really important, manage metadata, document views, and uploading documents. Now, I'm making the assumption that SharePoint is your corporate repository. Under that assumption, then there are 5 possible software products that you can use to manage records in SharePoint. They are Gimel, Microsoft Purview, Collabware, RecordPoint, or Opus by AvePoint. And it doesn't matter which of the 5 you will be using in your EDRMS. This session is entirely neutral. It means that everything you learn in this session is equally applicable no matter which of the 5 products you use, okay? Now, for these 7 SharePoint skills, you need to know them at an administrator level. That means as much as anybody in IT, okay? You don't need to know really much else about SharePoint, just these 7 functions, and we'll be covering each of these 7. So what does this mean for the job role of the records manager? Well, you're going to need some new skills, certainly these 7 SharePoint skills. You'll also have to master what I call the ninja level mastery of the records software. And that means you need to create automation rules, which we'll talk about shortly. And also, in any modern EDRMS, you have to be able to prove that the thing is compliant with record keeping requirements. Is it compliant? Yes or no? If so, how do you prove it? So you need to be able to prove on a daily basis that your system is compliant. So we're going to talk about how to set up and configure SharePoint so that you can prove it. We won't be talking about how you can prove it. That's another session entirely. Now, you'll notice there's an item here called Manage the IMAs. IMAs are representatives of records in the department. They're embedded in departments. They have 7 minor duties to carry out for support and ongoing health of the EDRMS. So we call them IMAs, Information Management Administrators. Some people know them as records officers. And there are new things you're going to have to do. You're going to have to measure and prove the key performance measures that prove that your system is compliant. Every now and then, maybe every year or so, you might conduct a disposition of electronic records. You'll definitely be reporting on several things, and you're going to have to monitor a weakness in SharePoint, which is SharePoint allows you to submit documents that are missing mandatory metadata. That's a real problem, but we're all going to have to live with that. So what exactly does compliance mean? Well, to me, it means that all the documents or content in SharePoint, and that includes both documents and emails, comply with the retention schedule, meaning that all the documents are locked down or immutable, and they are assigned a category in the retention schedule, a business activity and a retention rule. So how do we do that? Well, before we look at that, here are some sobering numbers to think about. If we were to have, let's say, 1,000 users, then it turns out that on average in a modern EDRMS, there are 12 records per day flowing into the system. Why 12? That's an average of 10 emails and 2 documents per day that meet the criteria of a record and therefore should be managed as a record. So that's 12 records per person per day times 1,000 users. That's 12,000 a day. So when you think about it, it's not a fixed set of records. It's a flow. It's a flow of 12,000 every single day of the working week, which is 2.7 million in a year. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, it's because you won't be able to interfere with that. At 12,000 a day, you can't adjust it. You can't measure it. You can't go in and do anything 12,000 times a day because that would require 12,000 minutes, which would take you 25 person days of work to go in and do anything whatsoever with those 12,000 records. And that's just in one day. Imagine you let 3 days worth build up, which is 36,000. Now you're going to need 75 days of work to examine or check those. So what does that mean? Well, it means this. The users, if we were to leave this up to the users, and you know the truth, right? You know that if I take a document and give to 10 users at random, and I say, is this a record? I'll get up to 10 different answers. And those answers can change depending on their mood, their feeling at the time, whether the dog ate their homework or whatever. Okay. So the fact is that we cannot count on users to do this 12,000 times a day and get it right. And by this, I mean, tell us it's a record and classify it against the retention schedule. In the real world, what I'm finding is that when I ask people in my client organizations, when's the last time you saw the retention schedule? Most people say, retention schedule? I've heard of it, but I've never seen it. So please, if you think that users are going to do this 12,000 times a day and get it right, you're sadly mistaken. It's just not going to happen. It has never worked in my entire career. I've never seen this work, and I'm not about to. Okay. So the conclusion, the inevitable conclusion, is that we have to automate this. In other words, the software is going to have to do this 12,000 times a day, not the users. So your job is to set up SharePoint so that it can do it. Now, here's another philosophy for you. Where does compliance come from? Does it come from the end users, where the users are deciding what the retention rules will be on what documents? Or does it come from you? Do you impose it on the users, whether they like it or not? Okay. The obvious answer is, again, we know that we can't count on the users. So if we can't count on the users, then the only way we can do it is to impose it on people. And to do that, we're going to need automation. So that's where the records keeping software comes into play. And remember this, the SharePoint itself does not manage records, nor will it ever manage records. That's what the records software is for, one of those 5 products. So that's where the automation is going to happen. Okay. So that's it for a crash course in EDRMS. Now let's get down to business with SharePoint. I'm going to assume that you know very little about SharePoint. So we're going to start from the very basics. So every document in SharePoint has metadata, permissions, and an audit trail of events that happened to that document. Next concept here is content type. What's a content type? It's the mechanism by which metadata is assigned to documents. Every single document in SharePoint has to have metadata. Okay? Every single document. There are no exceptions whatsoever. So all documents have to have a content type, as I said. And here we have 6 documents, document 1 through 6. And in SharePoint, we have 2 content types, one called contracts and one called travel. The contracts content type has these 5 black fields as a base and these 3 red fields as specific to contracts, whereas a travel content type has the same 5 base fields and these 3 green travel specific fields. Now, we don't yet know how the content type gets assigned to the documents, but what we know so far is that every document in SharePoint is assigned to a to a content type, which determines its metadata. So D1, D3, D2, and D3 have all been assigned the content type contracts. Therefore, the user has to fill out the black and the red fields, whereas documents 4, 5, and 6 were assigned the content type travel, and therefore they have to fill in the 5 black base fields and the 3 green travel related fields. Okay, so that's the mechanism by which metadata gets assigned in SharePoint. Now, in SharePoint, we have all documents have to go to somewhere. They have to go somewhere, and those places I'll call locations. Okay, so locations have names. So here we have 3. Location 1 called contracts, location 2 called travel, and location 3 called contracts, travel. Now, each location is assigned a content type. So therefore, any document you put in that location now will have that metadata assigned to it. So if I put a document in the location called contracts, because it has the contracts content type assigned to it, I have to fill out the red contract related fields. Okay. Similarly with location 2 for travel. And in the 3rd location, I have both content types assigned to that location. So when I put a document there, I have to choose which content type I'm going to use. Okay. There's a little more to it than that, but that's the simple version of it. I much prefer the scenario on the left where it's one content type per location. It's much simpler for users. Now, what does the SharePoint structure look like? Well, sites and libraries, that's pretty much it. What's a site? A site is a collection of libraries. A library is where you store documents. Now, a library can be broken into folders, but that's generally a bad idea, okay? Um, when it comes to libraries, to folders in SharePoint, there are 2 schools of thought. One is folders are great, there's nothing wrong with them. And the other is folders are bad and they shouldn't exist in SharePoint. I'm a member of the latter school of thought, okay? The reason why SharePoint was invented in the first place is because we had a problem with file shares over the last 20 or 30 years. In my clients, the average department has 70,000 folders accumulated over the last couple of decades, and an average of 7 documents per folder. 70,000 places. 70,000. And that's just a department. So the whole idea of SharePoint is let's make all that go away. 70,000 places to store documents is more than a little crazy. So let's just give that up. So the idea of SharePoint is we lose folders and we gain metadata. Metadata is a replacement for folder nesting. So think of it this way. The libraries in SharePoint are top-level folders, equivalent to top-level folders in your filing structure. And for every subfolder beneath the folder, which we call a nesting level, a piece of metadata can substitute for each nesting level. So we'll get to that in a moment, but the idea is folders are bad. Generally, there are a couple of use cases where they're legitimately good idea, but in general, folders are not good. One of my personal tests to see if someone really has put together an effective SharePoint site is I look for folders. And if I see a lot of folders, especially nested folders, I know that that is not a good SharePoint deployment. A good SharePoint deployment should have almost no folders at all. Now, one of the most important aspects of SharePoint for EDRMS is an artifact called document sets. You must know what a document set is. I would go so far as to say you cannot do a proper EDRMS without document sets. It's the key to EDRMS compliance. Why? Because over 60% of your records are case records. Now, we'll talk about what they are in a minute, but um, each document set forms a case. Now, in SharePoint, a document set is a folder, quote unquote, but it's a highly specialized folder. It has certain magical characteristics which are perfect for electronic record keeping and particularly for cases, okay? So we'll talk about that in a minute, but in this screen capture down below, you'll see that we have a library called procurement, competitive, and in it, there are these 6 things right here. And those 6 are document sets. You see that unique icon there? So from the perspective of SharePoint, a document set is a container. It is similar to a folder in some ways, but it's highly specialized. And its purpose is to group together related documents that are different from other documents. That's its purpose, okay? Now, let's get into the metadata a little deeper here. So in SharePoint, a metadata field is called a column, okay? Column. And every library contains or has associated with it a content type, which in turn contains or defines a set of columns. So again, I often call a content type a bag of columns, right? Just to get the point across. Now, every column has to have a unique name different from all other columns. And what you'll see in a minute is that there's 2 names for every column in SharePoint. There's actually 3, but the third one we don't care about. It has a display name, which is visible on the screen, and an internal name, which is not normally visible on the screen, and you cannot change it. Okay, we'll see that in a moment. So if you have 3 libraries called projects, contracts, and employees, you might have a column called project end date, contract end date, and termination date for employees, right? You could do this. You could, instead of having 3 separate columns, you could have one column called end date and use the same column in 3 different libraries, but with different display names. That's what I'm doing here, right? So in any SharePoint architecture, you want to minimize the number of unique columns. So this is a way to do it, is to have one column in 3 different libraries with 3 different display names, but it's only one unique column, okay? So what does metadata look like? Well, let's pretend we have a retention schedule. And now in a retention schedule, as you know, is just a list of business activities. So an activity is a record series, which is what I will refer to as a category. Activity, record series, category. That's what's in a retention schedule. It's a business activity. And we will have a retention rule for each of those business activities. But here is descriptive metadata for each business activity. So this is what the metadata might look like for expense reimbursement versus fleet vehicle maintenance. So if you imagine each one of these was a library, then, and you had a document about an expense reimbursement, and you accidentally went to put it into fleet vehicle maintenance library, then look at what you'd have to fill in. That's pretty different than expense reimbursement. So the odds that somebody could accidentally put a document in the wrong library is virtually nil. It would almost take an act of malfeasance to do it. So across our EDRMS client base, we have noticed that the average healthy EDRMS has an average of 14 metadata fields. But of those 14, the user only has to fill in 2.1. So we have our cake and eat it too. When you first deploy SharePoint, you'll get this following complaint from almost everybody. Oh, I don't like SharePoint. Why not? Because every time I put a document in, I have to fill in this metadata field. So much work. So much work. It's awful. I hate it. So that's what you're going to hear. So some people, including people who build, design, and deploy SharePoint, are kind of allergic to metadata. They think more is bad, okay, because of all this work. But properly deployed, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have rich metadata, but low burden on the users. So I believe that more metadata is better. And here's my rule of thumb. If a piece of metadata can be useful for retrieval, it should exist. If not, it shouldn't exist. Simple as that. Very, very simple. So here is a screen capture of what it's like to create a column in SharePoint. So you'll notice right here in the screen, it says column name. That should really say column display name. Okay, so we're entering a display name of project end date. Now, there's a bunch of other characteristics which we won't get into for now. Now, here's a little further depth to this. We're in the middle of the screen where we're entering a new column called project end date. But above in the browser URL, it actually contains the secret internal column name for that column. And I blew it up down below so you could hopefully read it. It says field equals END, uppercase DATE. Field equals end date. Notice it's stripped out some stuff. You don't get a choice as to what SharePoint calls the column internally. And once it's set, once that column exists, it can never be changed for life. It's on it for life. Now, why does that matter? Well, it doesn't matter right now, but it could matter downstream when you get deeper into columns and when you want to do workflows, queries, and other things. The internal field name becomes very important. Now, here's a list of, it's a spreadsheet, a list of metadata columns for libraries. So the library is a business activity. So here we have 3: acquisitions, analysis, and audits. And you can see where we get the average of 14, right? And we have the display name for every column. We have the order and a bunch of other things that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But this is a spreadsheet that we normally build to define what goes into a library. What columns do we need for each of these libraries? So we call these metadata mappings. You'll notice down here, there's subject keywords here, subject keywords up there, subject keywords down here. It's for every single library. They all have subject keywords. That's one column used in 1, 2, 3 different places, so 3 different libraries. One column, 3 locations. But that's 3 mappings that you need to define in this spreadsheet because you have to tell SharePoint when you're creating columns that this column goes in this library, audits, the analysis library, and the acquisitions library. Okay? So this can be quite a large spreadsheet. The intent of it is to hand over to IT and say, now, here's what we need, go build it. Now, in SharePoint, as it turns out, there are 5 different types of lists. So what is a list? Well, when you think of metadata in SharePoint, think of it like this. All columns or fields have 2 behaviors. Either you type something in or you pick from a list, right? Like you're ordering a sweater on Amazon and you have 3 choices, small, medium, or large, and that's it. You don't get any other choices. That's a list, right? Turns out, statistically, in a modern EDRMS, about 20% of all the columns are populated with a list. Now, it's not totally true to say you're either list or free text entry. There are dates and other specialized types of fields, but in general, it's either a list or something you can type in, okay? Out of those 5 list types, the one that you want to use almost all the time is called managed metadata. And why the heck is that? What's a managed metadata list? Well, when you're creating lists in SharePoint, if you in order to make a change in a value in a list, like let's say you have a list of fleet vehicles, you've got 25 fleet vehicles, and you have vehicle numbers, so you can choose which vehicle number. Well, when you get a new vehicle, you have to add it to the list. So if you don't use managed metadata, if you use one of these other lists, then you're going to have to call IT and they'll have to do it on your behalf. Okay? Whereas if it's managed metadata, you can have one of your IMAs, one of your departmental representatives, or you, the records manager, can can edit the list as often as you want without having to bother IT. Okay, that's really important because if you had to go to IT, IT's phone would never stop ringing. So they pretty much all have to be managed metadata. So that's the two reasons why there are two reasons why you want to use managed metadata for all your lists. Number one is you can maintain it without counting on IT. Number two is that the list data can be hierarchical, as you see here. I think it goes up to 6 or 7 levels. I'm going to play it safe and say 6 levels. I should say down to 6 levels. So you can have a list that looks like this: cities, and it starts with states or provinces, and then it goes down to regions and then down to cities, right? So it's hierarchical, which is very, very handy. Here's an example of a few real world lists, and here's a list on the bottom of facilities. Um, any EDRMS project is going to have multiple buildings, and you need a list of those buildings, right? Now, this is what I mentioned earlier. This is a horrible, horrible feature of SharePoint, if I may say. You can put documents in all day long and ignore the metadata and not fill in a darn thing. That's tragic, but nothing we can do about it. It's a huge, huge problem. And it can threaten compliance because some, not all, but some of your metadata is going to be used in compliance automation rules, which means if you don't have the metadata, you're no longer compliant for those documents. So it threatens compliance, okay? And also it prevents search and retrieval. It makes it almost impossible to build workflows based on those documents. So one way or the other, hook or by crook, you've got to get that mandatory metadata filled in. There's no real out-of-the-box fix for that. So what you have to do is you have to monitor, chase your users. Now, there are two ways that you can get a list. Neither one is all that straightforward. One way is you can engineer a custom report by going under the hood of SharePoint and giving you a report of all the documents missing mandatory metadata. It's a little tricky to do, but it can be done with Power BI. That's the report writer for SharePoint. A way easier approach is to use our Catalyst toolkit. One of our Catalyst tools is a utility that will go under the hood and give you a list of all the documents that are missing mandatory metadata. Really important. Then you can filter the list in a spreadsheet, send it out to departments, and get after the users to get that data filled in. This is an example of the Catalyst output right here. Here's the library, the document's name, and the missing field name. Now, I shortened this list up, but it can also contain the offending user, right? And the department, if you wish. Okay, now for the tough stuff. This is the toughest part of this session, which is what the heck are case records? Case records are records that belong to a case category or business activity. And what you need to know is that for you, the minimum, the bare minimum of percentage of all your records, 12,000 a day, that are case records is 60%. If you're a municipality, you're likely higher towards the 80%. So that means that you've got to get this right. Now, the record software, no matter which of the 5 products you buy, the record software will force you to tell it. Of all those 12,000 records coming at me every day, tell me which ones are the case records. In your retention schedule, you have to specify which categories are case records. Why? Because the software uses a different algorithm to compute disposition for case records. This is going to have a profound, let me repeat this, it's going to have a profound effect on your SharePoint information architecture. What is SharePoint information architecture? It's the answer to this question. Where are all our documents going to go in SharePoint? In other words, what sites, what libraries, what metadata do we need, and that kind of thing. It's how you set up and configure SharePoint. That's going to be driven heavily by case records, okay? And many vendors and many professional records people are confused about case records. So it's vital that we get this right. So case records are records about a business activity regarding a person, a place, an event, or a thing. Now, what do those uh, four have in common? They all end or die, right? So each of those business activities is an activity that's divided into repeated adventures. My word, adventures. An adventure is an activity that starts and stops and generates records unique to that activity. Then you do it again. Only the second time you do it, you're generating another set of records on a different adventure. For example, an audit. You might do a health and safety audit in February, and you're going to generate records related to that health and safety audit. Full stop. Comes to an end. Then in July, you might do another audit, perhaps of financial statements. That's a different audit. And the records to that second financial audit have nothing to do with the records of the first audit in February. So the records in any one adventure are different from and independent of the records of a different adventure. What do we call each adventure? A case. Okay? So your job in SharePoint is to keep those case records separate from all the records of other case records. So here are three examples of case records. Contracts, because contracts start and end, and the records of each contract are different from that of another contract. Employees, that's self-evident, and projects, right? And I could go on and on and on. Audits, investigations, collective bargaining agreements, union grievances, fleet vehicles, right? Vehicles are things that come to an end. They're assets, okay? Meetings and conferences, those are events that come to an end. Then you do it again. You have another conference or another meeting and it ends, okay? So the retention rule for case records, like all retention rules, has three parts: a trigger, a duration or retention period, and an action at the end of its life, such as destroy or transfer. So the trigger for case records is the end date of that adventure or that case end date, okay? So again, the retention rule for case records is end date plus retention period followed by action, okay? Three parts. And the idea is that normally the software, the record software, will destroy all the records in the entire case at the same time. Okay? Now, the opposite of that, 40% of them, are administrative records. That's what we call non-case records. And that's an ongoing business activity that never stops. Kind of like invoicing, you get invoice processing every single day of the week. It never really stops. And there's no adventure that you can pull out of it, right? There's no adventure. There's no start, stop, and a separate set of related records. Although you could say each fiscal year could be a case. That's okay, but not normally. Anyway, the retention rule is different. The retention rule's trigger is now the document's age. So here's how the software, all five products, calculates the age. The way disposition works for these records is the trigger date is age. So they say the today's date minus the date of the document equals the document's age. And then if the age is less than the retention period, then it's kept. If it's greater, it's marked for disposition. Okay. So if I have a document that dated, a PDF dated 2010, that's a 15-year-old document. So the software says today's date, 2025, minus the document's date, 2010, equals 15. The retention period is 10 years. Oh, we're 5 years late. That thing is going. It's going out of here, right? That's how it works. Now, I know what you're thinking. In SharePoint, SharePoint says, well, I'm going to calculate based on the create date. But in SharePoint, the create date is a lie. It's not the create date. It's the date it was put into SharePoint, right? You all know that. So that calculation is going to be wrong. And yes, that's what happens with Purview. But that's for another day. At least now you know the difference between admin and case records. So remember, we have in our example, for 1,000 users, we have 12,000 records flowing in to SharePoint every single day. 12,000. So 12,000 times 60% is 7,200. So every day, 7,200 records are going to be case records. They have to go somewhere. And the balance will be admin records. They have to go somewhere in SharePoint as well. Now, before we look at SharePoint any more closely, think about this for a minute. I have 1,000 contracts, 1,000 projects, and 1,000 employees. Okay, in our example here. Let's just talk about contracts for a minute. If I'm going to put a document in SharePoint about a contract, then I have no choice but to force the user to tell me which of those 1,000 contracts this document or email is about. True? I have no choice. If I'm working in HR and I'm putting in a document about an employee, Barney Rubble, I have to say, here's my document. But SharePoint must force me to say, well, wait a minute. It's about an employee. You're in a library called employees, but you got to tell me which of our 1,000 employees this document is about. We have no choice. That's a mathematical reality. So yes, there has to be a metadata field or some mechanism of forcing the user to choose between 1,000 cases every single time I put a case record into SharePoint. Okay? Remember, 7,200 records are flowing into SharePoint every single day. Where are they going to go? Well, we have 1,000 contracts. That's 1,000 cases. That's 1,000 destinations. We have 1,000 employees. That's 1,000 more cases and 1,000 event dates. We have 1,000 projects, and that's 1,000 possible places to put project-related documents. So a total of 3,000 cases. That's 3,000 places for those 7,200 records to go. But this is mathematically unavoidable. Even if you take records management right off the table, we have no choice. No choice. But every time you put a document in SharePoint, you have to select from a case. You have to say, which case is this related to? So here's where it all comes together. Here we have a records retention schedule and a SharePoint with 250 admin categories. That's 250 different places in SharePoint for this record to go. I have only three case categories: contracts, employees, and projects. But I have 1,000 cases for each of those three. That's 3,000 potential places for those records to go. So if I take 7,200, subtract that from 12,000, I get 4,800. So out of our 12,000 records, 7,200 of those are being sprayed towards SharePoint at 3,000 target places. Meanwhile, 4,800 of them are being sprayed at 250 places in SharePoint. Grand total, 3,250 different places for a record to land in SharePoint. And by the way, each of these cases can have a uniquely different end date. So that means you have to store 1,000 contract end dates, 1,000 employee termination dates, and 1,000 project end dates. You have to store those 3,000 dates somewhere because the record software can't do its job and apply disposition without those 3,000 dates. So what does this mean? This means that you have to build 3,250 different places in SharePoint. Now, this is just a playground example. You have vehicles, you have 50 vehicles, that's 50 places for vehicle records. You have 10 or 20 union grievances a year, that's 10 or 20 places. You do 50 audits a year, that's 50 more cases. I could go on and on and on. You have a lot of cases in the tens of thousands. Yes, get over it. You're going to have a SharePoint with tens of thousands of places to store records. It's normal. It's what you have to have. Perfectly normal, and it can't function without that. Okay? thanks to case records. Now, this is where everything I've told you about case records is going to come together, okay? And it's a good quiz of, do you really understand case records or not? So I'm going to explain this slide twice. The first time I will talk in records language, and the second time I'm going to give you exactly the same explanation, but in SharePoint language. So here goes. I have a category in the retention schedule called contracts. In it, I have 3 cases: lovely landscaping, safety security, and tasty catering. Each case is a category. Each case is a contract, sorry, a contract. I have 7 metadata fields F1 through F7. Now, fields F1 through F5 are called case fields. Fields F6 and F7 are called document fields, and the behavior is different. Fields F1 through F5 are created by the IMA or records manager only, once only, and only at the time the case is created. And the values of those 5 fields are replicated automatically across all the documents that flow into that case over time. Got that? Okay. Why do we do that? Well, it's because if people were putting 100 documents into this case, for example, why should they have to type in a contract name 100 times? Or the vendor name 100 times, or the dollar amount 100 times? There's only one vendor, one contract name, and $1 amount for that contract. So don't bother the user with it. Now, fields F6 and F7, those 2 fields are green, and they are entered by the users, and the value is unique to that document, which only makes sense, right? So here comes the second explanation. Same thing, but now I'm going to talk SharePoint language, okay? We have one library called contracts. In that library, we have 3 document sets, one for lovely landscaping, one for safety security, and one for tasty catering, okay? We have 7 columns. Of those 7 columns, 5 are different in behavior than the latter 2, F6 and F7. The first 5 fields, F1 through F5, are called shared columns. Columns F6 and F7 are non-shared columns. Columns F1 through F5 are entered once only by the information management administrator or records manager, only at the time the document set was created, and the value they type into these 5 columns is automatically replicated across all the documents in that document set. Meanwhile, fields F6 and F7, called non-shared columns, are entered by the users, and the users, what they type into these fields is unique to that particular document, okay? So there you have it. This is how we end up with rich metadata, an average of 14 columns, but the users only generally enter about 2.1 on average. So now, let's tie all this together and build ourselves an EDRMS. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to bake a 3-layer cake. Retention schedule, SharePoint architecture, and then rules-based record keeping, RBR rules. We're going to use the one-to-one-to-one approach, which says that a category in the retention schedule equals a library in SharePoint of the same name, and in that SharePoint library is a content type of the same name with metadata appropriate for that category. 2 examples: safety. It's an admin library. The library is called safety. The content type is called safety. We have another library called contracts. The library name is contracts. The content type is contracts, but this library is split into document sets, one for each case. So on the right, let's pretend for the rest of this session that we have 800 categories, which is about average for a modern municipality. 800 categories in the retention schedule. Of those, 60% or 480 will look like the right-hand side. They will be the retention, they'll be grouped by case, and the retention rule is applied to the case. So if you think of a conveyor belt, the cases are moving along the conveyor belt, and they fall off only when the event occurs and the retention period has been met. So the retention is applied to the case as a whole, not individual documents. Meanwhile, 320 of them are not divided into cases, and the retention rule is applied directly to each document. So you have a conveyor belt with documents moving along and tipping off the edge when they reach their retention period. So that's the first layer, retention schedule. Let's move it up to the second layer. Now we're going to turn those categories into libraries. 800 libraries, 480 on the right, 320 on the left. The 480 on the right are divided into document sets, one for each case. And the metadata is unique to each library. So we're going to have an average of 14 columns per library and a healthy EDRMS. You multiply 14 by 800 and you get 11,200 mappings. That's what I showed you earlier in the spreadsheet, right? The same metadata field may exist in multiple libraries, but you still have to specify or map that column to that library. So yeah, imagine a spreadsheet that you entered by hand with 11,200 rows in it. That's what you need to build and do. That's what we do every day here around here. We do those spreadsheets, right? That's called the SharePoint information architecture. Now, let's go to the top of the pyramid here. Now we're going to create automation rules because we said earlier we can't count on users to get this stuff right. So what do these rules look like? Well, we'll show the detail in a minute, but at a high level, they're simply saying this for this content in SharePoint over here, apply this retention rule. But in this library, apply this different retention rule. And in this library, use this rule, but only when this condition is met. So here's an example. If a library is employee onboarding, then retention can be 5 years for everything in that library. But over here in operator rounds, the field approved must contain yes before the retention kicks off. That's up to the business, right? But notice we're depending on metadata to know when it's been approved, right? So what do these retention rules look like? Well, here are some examples. Remember, there are 5 products. They all have not one, but 2 sets of rules. On the left, retention rules. On the right, content rules. What's the difference? Well, retention rules are simple. 3 parts, a trigger, a period, and an action. Document date, well, let's use the most famous Canadian one. 7 years and destroy. The trigger is the document date, which is used to compute the age. The period is 5 years, and the action is destroy. Very, very simple. If you do have 800, and you will if you're a municipality, and you'll have 800 categories, I estimate that you would have roughly 300 unique retention rules in total. Simple, no big deal. Each rule, however, has to have a name. It's shown in blue on the left here. You have to give it a unique name. So yeah, you have to come up with 300 names for your retention rules. So that's just the retention rules. They sit in the software, the record software, and they do nothing. They just sit there, okay? In a pile. This is where the action happens. Content rules. What's a content rule? A content rule says for this content in SharePoint, use or apply this retention rule in blue. So a real simple example. If the library is audits, then apply Rule 3 to everything in that library, which would be audit end date plus 7 years and then transfer. Very, very simple, okay? But like I said earlier, the average number, maybe I didn't say this earlier, but the average number of content rules per category or in library is 3. If that were true, and it is, then For 800 categories, you need to create 2,400 content rules. Yeah, you do. And where do those rules come from? From you. They don't fall out of flying saucers, I hate to say. So let's look at some examples here. If library projects has a metadata field approved and it has 100 documents in there, one of the documents says approved is yes. Well, for that document in that library, apply the rule R1, which is 5 years and destroy. Simple. But what about the other documents where approved is no? Apply Rule 5, which is document date plus 25 years and then keep permanently. Now, these are just fictional examples, but you get the point, right? So these content rules contain or call upon metadata and library names to do their job. Once you build these 2,400 rules, go take a vacation and relax because now these rules are enforced 24 hours a day and you don't have to worry about it. These will automatically classify, lock down, or declare all the records by themselves. Okay? I thought I'd show you a couple of real live examples. Of the 5 products, this is one out of Texas called Gimmel. And here's an example of what it looks like to type one of these content rules. You see the property, the operator, and the value. The property, approved, the operator, equals, and the value, yes. Okay. Here's another example from a company called AppPoint out of New Jersey. They make a product called Opus. And this screen shows what it's like to type in one of these content rules. And you see the same stuff again. You see the column name, approved, equals, this is the operator, equals, yes, right? And you can get more sophisticated. You can say it matches, you can say greater than, less than, multiple conditions. And then you apply down here where my cursor is right now. Then if it meets these conditions, then apply the following term. What the heck is a term? A term is the retention rule on the left. That's what Opus calls a term, okay? These rules here on the right, in Gimmel, they're called life cycles. In Opus, they're called rules. In Microsoft Purview, they're called auto apply policies. Every one of the 5 products calls it something different. Doesn't matter. They're all basically the same. Up top in this pyramid, your job is to create 300 unique retention rules and 2,400 content rules in whatever record software you purchased. Okay. Once you've done that, what happens in effect is that all 3 layers of this system are now locked together like Lego blocks. They fit tightly together. It's strong. They don't move. What happens if you start mucking around with the names of these 800 libraries? The rules break. You're no longer compliant. What happens if you start noodling around with the metadata or column names? The rules break and they no longer work, right? So you can't have what we call SharePoint in the wild, which is libraries and metadata popping up every day of the week, 10 times a day. How the heck are you supposed to govern that? You can't. So the system has to be static. It has to stay put. If someone comes up with a new business activity, then go down to the retention schedule, build it here, build it in the SharePoint, and then build the rules for it before you let anybody use that library. Because every library must be governed according to the retention schedule, right? Now, here's a written example of one of those 800 categories for audits. I chose that because everybody knows audits, right? So here we have 9 case fields and 4 document fields for a total of 13 columns, okay? And if you look closely, we have 4 fields or columns that are populated with a list. Audit types, pertinent regulations, regulator, and document type, okay? Those are drop-down lists. So that's 4 out of 13, not bad. Now down below, we have 6 content rules. Remember the rules on the right. And every content rule is going to call upon or use or reference metadata. For example, There's a field up here called critical. It's right here. It's a yes/no field. If the critical is marked yes, then the retention is permanent, right? So that's a compliance rule. That means this field is not negotiable. We need it for compliance, right? If the document type says report draft, like here are the list of document types right here. If it's a draft report, then the retention is audit end date plus 15 years. But if it's a final report, it's permanent, right? So out of these 6 rules, in blue, this is the metadata that the rules call upon or reference. So therefore, these fields are what I call non-negotiable mandatory compliance fields, okay? And that's what I mean when I say that the system is locked together like Lego blocks. Okay, so no matter which of these 5 products you buy, here's a cold, hard reality. You have to go through 6 steps to get this system to an EDRMS state. What do you have to do? Well, the first thing you have to do is rewrite your retention schedule so that it's machine readable, okay, and product neutral. It's the first step along the way to going inside your record software, okay, the first step. Second step is you have to make it product specific because all 5 products have a different structure to the retention schedule. So what you cannot have is a retention schedule that has mushy stuff in it that's meant for users to read and understand. You have to have a retention schedule that no one will ever see, read, or experience. In other words, machine readable. It's only going to be used by the machine, not by humans. That's what you need to do in steps 1 and 2. Then you have to get it into your record software. You have to import it or type it in. I recommend import. You have to get it into your record software, one of these 5 products. All 300 of the rules, but only 300. No big deal, right? But you do have to rewrite your retention schedule. Now, along comes SharePoint. Well, you've got to have a SharePoint information architecture that will allow your record software to do its job. We call that the information architecture. That means you have to define 800 libraries, 800 content types, 11,200 columns, and the lists and the values of those lists, right? Probably 200 or 300 lists. So do all this in a spreadsheet. This could take a year, 2, or 3. No problem. I've seen it take 3.5. When you're done with that monster spreadsheet, you hand it over as a gift to IT. In step 5, when you say, IT, by the way, here's a spreadsheet for you with 11,200 rows in it. Can you, and it specifies 800 libraries, 800 content types, and 11,200 column mappings. You're not that busy this afternoon, are you? So you hand that spreadsheet over and wait for them to construct it. And you got to tell them, don't deviate from the plan, okay, or it won't be compliant. How long is that going to take them? I don't know, 6 months, maybe a year. Now, along comes step 6. What is step 6? Step 6 is at the top of the pyramid. Now you are going to create those 2,400 content rules. You cannot do it unless and until SharePoint is fully deployed. Why not? Because all those screens you're going to fill in, the instructions you give the software will check and make sure that those metadata fields and those libraries exist. So you have to be finished your full SharePoint deployment before you can type your automated rules, okay? And I estimate that to create 2,400 rules will take you roughly 45 days if you never took a break, went to the bathroom, ate, or slept. 24 person days of effort, 8-hour days, okay? Now, the good news is that we created this a toolkit called Catalyst Information Governance Toolkit, and it will take the spreadsheet from number 4, and it will deploy the entire SharePoint information architecture in less than a day. Okay? In the future, meaning next year, it will even generate the automated 2,400 rules, but that's a future release. Right now, we're creating those manually. in a spreadsheet and loading them into the software. But either way, the Catalyst will save you up to 2 years of work and hundreds of thousands of dollars just in that one thing alone. And if you're a municipality, then we also have steps 1, 2, and 3 all done as well. Okay? So pretty much the whole shebang is done for a municipality. For a non-municipality, we have about 800 categories for you that are pretty universal. For a municipality, we have 2,200 categories in the retention schedule, all machine readable, all with metadata. Okay, so I thought we're done. What I thought I'd do before we let you go is to give you a quick look at what this looks like in a real deployment. So this is a small but valid demonstration system. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Now this is bare bones. This is zero coding, zero customization of SharePoint, absolutely zero. This is just SharePoint out of the box. And what we did is we created a landing page with 9 categories in it. So this would be a small business unit. And each of these rectangles is a business activity, which is a library in SharePoint. Okay. This is where my records go for my little department. Okay. My little business unit. Up top, we can navigate all the libraries of the entire SharePoint with a navigation up here. We also have a library index, which is a list of every single library. Remember, in a typical municipality, we're talking 800 libraries. And we have a description and a case naming convention for the cases, status of each library, and the retention rule. So users, with one mouse click, can examine all 800 and say, is this the right one? Is this the one I should be using? And if it is, they can just click over here on the left and go directly to it, like advice formal. Here I am in advice formal, right? So that's just a handy tool that we supply. Now, let's go into one. Let's go into procurement competitive. I picked that one because competitive procurement is a case category. It has adventures. Each procurement is an adventure with a start and an end, right? So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 adventures going on, 6 cases. And we're going to look at safety, security, okay? So if we go into that case, we have to just click on it. I have 4 documents in there, okay? First thing I want to show you is the metadata from left to right, okay? Now, these little round buttons up top are the views. What does that mean? It means I can choose what metadata I wish to see every time I go into a library. This view here is we call all columns. All columns. Look at this. Look at how wide it is. It's almost endless. There's some pretty bizarre stuff in there that I don't understand because I'm not a procurement officer. But look at this stuff. Baseline value, value added, agreement. Agreement what? Agreement value final and initial. I don't know what that stuff is. That's highfalutin procurement know-how. But I'm a procurement person. I understand. I dig that stuff, right? Here, I can display just the case columns. Remember the diagram from earlier? The 5 orange case fields? These are the case fields, the ones that I, as a user, cannot touch, should not touch, cannot touch, right? I don't need to. I can look at it if I want to, but I can't change them. This is what I'm most likely interested in, which is my user columns. These are the fields I can enter, right? So I have and that's this view here, user columns, is pretty much universal in all libraries. But this one is my personal one. These are the columns I wish to see every time I come in here, and the only ones I'm interested in. Okay. So let's upload a document. Here we go. We'll click the create or upload button and upload a file. I will pick myself a file, random, and it's uploading now. And there you go. Hands off the keyboard. I don't even have my hands on my mouse. I didn't touch a thing. So it's giving me a warning that there are two fields that are mandatory that I didn't bother to fill in. Okay. So I need to go to these two and add them. And what I should do is fill in any other non-mandatory metadata of interest. So let's do that. Let's do what we're supposed to do. Okay. Now there's a handy dandy button here called Edit All. I could do it here. Like I can see what I'm missing right here. It's in red. Enter the subject, right? And there's another one on the bottom. But what I prefer to do, this is just a personal preference. I love to click this Edit All because now look at it. It's bolder on the screen. It just looks better. And I had an extra mouse click there, so it disappeared on me. Here, there's what it looks like. It looks more like a form. I find that a friendlier view. And here's my second mandatory field right here, which is vehicle. So I have to pick a vehicle. I only have one in it right now, a fire truck, right? And I could do this if I wish. I could just type F and it would go to the Fs in that list, give me the fire truck, and then I can save. Okay. So that's how I enter metadata. I can do it in Edit Grid View. This is great for tinkering around with the metadata for multiple documents. For example, if I wanted to change this one to yes, I wanted to change that to a yes. What is this? Contains sensitive data. Where am I? Contains sensitive data. There's a lot of data here. So yes, no field. Disputed, award date, procurement type. This is all the case data here. Oh, I know why. I haven't selected my document. I'm looking at the case document, case data. So sensitive, contains sensitive information, right? So I don't want a no, I want a yes in this. Okay. Now I've got my yes here, but because I'm in grid view, I can behave like a spreadsheet. Now, if you're familiar with spreadsheets, you know that you can take a cell and drag it and replicate it in other cells. See how easy that was? I love the grid view. Why? Because I'm a spreadsheet aholic and I love this way to do it. But you don't have to do it in grid view. You can just do it on the right-hand side of the sheet here, or the screen. You can do it down here. You can click Edit All, which makes it into a form, right? Now I have a full screen form I can work with, okay? So there's many, many variants to this, many ways I can fill out the metadata. And up top, I can, again, navigate around all my libraries because there's 800 libraries. So you could go up here and navigate to any of the libraries. What you'll see in those libraries is going to be driven by permissions, right? This here is an advanced search where you can search across um, different sites and different libraries. That's not an out-of-the-box feature in SharePoint. You have to build a special search screen for that, okay? And over here we have preformed search queries where you predefine a search and store it and give it a name. This is a search called Show Me All Documents in All Libraries that Contain Sensitive Information. And there we have it, right? So you could have any number of these, any number at all. So that's it. Thank you for attending and be sure to check out our other videos. We have a growing number of videos. We try to add a full-scale 1-hour video every week, and we have many, many other shorter topical videos. But I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you at the next video.